Welcome back, my friend. Let everything slow. In the Warhammer 40,000 universe, most threats are understood as catastrophes. The Tyranids consume everything. Chaos corrupts everything. The Necrons reclaim everything. Each of these existential dangers is organized around a specific kind of ending. The galaxy consumed, the galaxy corrupted, the galaxy harvested. They are threats in the conventional sense of things that want the galaxy to be different from what it is, and are working toward that difference through violence. The Orks are different. The Orks do not want the galaxy to change. They want to fight in it. They have been fighting in it since before most of the galaxy's current civilizations existed, and they will be fighting in it when most of those civilizations have ended. And the specific quality of their relationship to the galaxy's ongoing violence is not the relationship of a destroyer or a conqueror. It is the relationship of something that was made for a purpose and has been fulfilling that purpose since the beginning of everything. They are the galaxy's oldest surviving created species. They were not the first to evolve, not the first to build civilization, not the first to reach for the stars. But they were specifically designed, engineered by beings of nearly divine capability, for a specific purpose in a specific conflict. And the design has been so successful that 60 million years of abandonment and neglect and autonomous reproduction have not diminished the fundamental qualities they were built with. Tonight we begin at the beginning, before the Waaagh. Before the first human had ever seen a green-skinned warrior shouting incomprehensible battle cries from inside an improbable vehicle. Before the galaxy had any name for what the Orks were. At the moment, the Old Ones built them. The war in heaven and the weapon that was made for it. The war in heaven. The conflict that the Warhammer 40,000 universe's oldest lore describes as the foundational catastrophe. The war between the Old Ones, who had seeded life across the galaxy for millions of years, and the Necronta and their Cetan star god patrons, who had chosen biotransference and metal over organic existence and had turned that choice into a war of extermination. The Old Ones were not warriors. They were gardeners, the specific kind of divine intelligence that shaped ecosystems and guided evolution and maintained the specific conditions that allowed life to flourish. Their capabilities were immense. Their specific orientation toward direct military conflict was not what those capabilities had been developed for. They needed soldiers, not simply in the tactical sense of needing bodies to fight, in the specific engineering sense of needing a species that could be produced in sufficient numbers, that could fight at the level the Necrons required, that could sustain casualties and keep fighting, that could operate without the specific resources and infrastructure that other armies required. They made the Krorks, the proto-Orks, the specific original form of what the Orks would eventually become, whose size and power and the specific collective psychic field they generated were calibrated for the demands of the war in heaven at its most extreme. Huge Orks, perfect Orks, everyone bigger than a clan chief, and rippling with green light. Orks as they were meant to be. The Krorks were designed to be the Old Ones' weapon, not their only weapon. The Eldar were also a product of the Old Ones' engineering, shaped for different qualities, built toward a different purpose. But the Krorks were the blunt instrument, the specific capability of overwhelming physical force applied in numbers large enough to matter against an enemy that had the technology of ancient star god civilization behind it. They were designed to grow in response to conflict. This is the single most important design decision the Old Ones made in creating the Ork species, and it is the reason that 60 million years later, the Orks are still the galaxy's most numerically abundant military species. An Ork grows larger and more powerful the more it fights. A war boss who has been fighting for decades is physically larger than one who has not. The specific biological mechanism by which combat experience translated into physical growth meant that the Old One's weapon became more powerful the more it was used. That the conditions of the war in heaven, which were the most intense military conditions the galaxy had ever produced, were producing Krorks whose individual size and collective field had been calibrated by the war itself. The Orks kept coming, and they kept getting bigger, until even the runts among them were as big as the war bosses. What the war produced. The war in heaven's scale was cosmological. It was fought across the galaxy. It consumed civilizations that had existed for millions of years. It produced the Chaos Gods as a side effect of its casualties. The mass death of billions of beings generating the psychic weight in the warp that eventually coalesced into the ruinous powers. The Krorks fought in it. They fought on behalf of the Old Ones, against the Necrons and the Citan, across planets and systems, and the specific geography of a conflict that had no fixed front line, because the combatants could move through space in ways that made the concept of a front line inapplicable. The passage describes what may be the end of the war in heaven. It was a big fight that kept getting bigger. I think the Orks won. Whether the Orks won the war in heaven in any meaningful strategic sense, whether their participation in the Old One's defense of the galaxy constituted a victory, is one of the law's maintained ambiguities. The Old Ones were gone by the war's end. The Citan was shattered into fragments and imprisoned by the Necrons they had empowered. The Necrons retreated into the Great Sleep. The Eldar survived and eventually built their empire. And the Krorks, the weapons the Old Ones had made, were without purpose, with nothing to focus on. The Orks in the vision turn on one another, until after much slaughter, there were Orks still, but they were nothing like the colossal fighters who'd been there before. This is the specific event that produced the Orks as the galaxy knows them in the 41st millennium. Not evolution, devolution. The Krorks, without the external pressure of the war in heaven to drive their growth, without the Old Ones to direct their purpose, turned on each other, fought among themselves, became something smaller than what they had been, in the specific way that things calibrated for enormous demands become when those demands are removed. The Orks that remained were still extraordinary, still the most numerous military species the galaxy had produced, still carrying the specific biological advantages that the Old Ones had built in, but not the Krorks of the war in heaven. Something that had been those creatures, distributed across the galaxy, self-reproducing through the spore mechanism that the Old Ones had designed to ensure their weapon could never be fully eliminated, gradually becoming what the galaxy would eventually know as Orks. The biology of survival. The Old Ones built the Orks to survive without them. This is the specific design principle that makes the Orks unlike any other created species in the galaxy. Most created species depend on their creators for maintenance, for purpose, for the specific institutional context that gives their existence direction. The Orks were designed to be autonomous, to reproduce without assistance, to spread without infrastructure, to fight without leadership that they did not generate themselves. Orks reproduce through spores, not through conventional biological reproduction in the way that most species reproduce, through fungal spores, microscopic organisms released continuously from every living Ork, that distribute through the environment and grow into new Orks autonomously. The specific mechanism of Ork reproduction makes them essentially impossible to eliminate from any world they have inhabited. Killing the Orks that are present does not address the spores that have been distributed into the soil and the water and the air, which will eventually produce more Orks from the planet's own material. The Orks are also self-sufficient in the most direct biological sense. They do not require complex food infrastructure. They can eat almost anything organic. Their skin is capable of photosynthesis. The green coloration that makes them immediately visually distinct is the presence of algae in their skin cells, which provide supplementary energy through light exposure. An Ork that cannot find food can survive on sunlight. They heal. Not at the specific transhuman rate of space marines, but with the particular resilience of something that was designed to absorb punishment and continue functioning. An Ork whose arm is cut off can reattach it if the limb is held in place. The biology will eventually fuse it back. An Ork decapitated but not destroyed will not necessarily die if the head and body are kept in proximity. They grow larger and stronger the more they fight. This is not metaphorical. The biology of Ork growth is directly responsive to combat. Hormones triggered by violence produce accelerated growth, larger musculature, thicker bone. The Ork who has been fighting for 50 years is physically larger than the Ork who has not, in a way that is measurable and documented. War bosses, who have survived by being the best fighters and have been fighting for the longest, are often significantly larger than an ordinary Ork, sometimes twice the size, carrying the specific accumulated mass of decades of violent growth. Gork and Mork, the Ork gods. The two divine presences that the Ork species believes in, with the specific totality of faith that only beings whose gods might actually be real can sustain. Gork and Mork. Not two gods of equal character, two gods of the same character expressed differently. Gork is brutally cunning. Mork is cunningly brutal. The specific distinction that Ork theology maintains between them is the ordering of the qualities rather than the qualities themselves. Both are defined by brute force and low cunning, with the emphasis reversed. A gathering of Orks generates a psychic field known as the Waaagh, which allows Orks to instinctively recognize who is bigger and therefore in charge. The Waaagh also seems to warp reality to fit Orkish beliefs, allowing their ramshackle technology to function properly. If Orks are convinced that their designs are sound and functional, the Waaagh makes them so. This is the specific phenomenon that makes the Orks theologically interesting in the Warhammer universe. Their gods are real in the specific sense that the psychic field generated by millions of Orks believing in them produces actual divine-scale entities in the warp. Gork and Mork are the accumulated psychic mass of every Ork who has ever fought and believed that the gods were watching and approving. The Waaagh field, the collective psychic energy that every gathering of Orks generates, is the specific expression of this divine relationship. It makes their weapons work when they should not. It makes their vehicles function when engineering would suggest they cannot. The famous observation about Ork vehicles: they are painted red because red goes faster. And in the Warhammer universe, for Orks, red vehicles do go faster, because the Waaagh field makes the belief literal. Other races have found that many Orkish devices simply do not work unless wielded by an Orkoid. The specific implication of this: the Orks are carrying something of what the Old Ones built into them across the millions of years since the war in heaven. Not simply the biological advantages, the psychic field that produces the Waaagh, the specific collective consciousness that makes their technology work and their gods real, was part of what the Old Ones designed. The weapon the Old Ones built was a weapon that became more powerful through collective belief, that generated its own divine support structure, that could never be truly leaderless, because the largest and strongest would always naturally dominate through the specific psychic recognition that the Waaagh field made automatic. The clans. The orc species is not monolithic. Within the broader category of orc, there are specific clans, the 6 major ones being Goths, Bad Moons, Evil Suns, Death Skulls, Blood Axes, and Snakebites. Each clan has a specific culture, a specific aesthetic, a specific approach to the business of fighting that distinguishes them from the others. Goths are the most traditional, the largest, the most aggressive, the most purely focused on close quarters combat in the specific way of something that values fighting above all other pursuits and has developed the specific capability for it that such values produce. Their color is black. Their preference is for getting as close to the enemy as possible, as fast as possible, and using whatever is at hand when they get there. Bad Moons have the most teeth. Orc wealth is measured in teeth. Not the teeth of enemies, but their own teeth, which continuously regrow and accumulate as a form of currency. Bad Moons grow teeth faster than other clans, a biological quirk that makes them the orc equivalent of nouveau riche, wealthy, flashy, fond of the best equipment that wealth can provide. Evil Suns love speed, red vehicles, the fastest bikes, the most mobile approach to warfare. Their specific enthusiasm for velocity produced the specific orc aesthetic of extremely loud, extremely fast, extremely dangerous vehicles that should not work and do. Death Skulls are the looters, blue paint for luck, and the specific dedication to acquiring whatever the other races have built and incorporating it into orc use. They are the specific clan that makes enemy technology work through sheer orcish appropriation, taking weapons and vehicles that were designed for human or elder or Tau physiology and making them functional through the specific combination of Waaagh field and orc ingenuity. Blood Axes have learned from humans. This makes them, in the eyes of other orcs, somewhat suspect. The specific stigma of a clan that has picked up too much of the enemy's way of doing things. They use tactics. They understand the concept of retreat. Neither of these things is normal orc behavior, and the fact that Blood Axes have incorporated them marks them as different in ways that the Waaagh-oriented culture of most orcs finds unsettling. Snakebites reject technology. In a species defined by the enthusiastic use of the most improbable technology, the snakebites stand apart by preferring the biological. The specific approach of riding squigs and using traditional weapons and maintaining a relationship to the old ways of the orc species before the war machines became central. Sleep well. 7 more parts remain, and the first Waaagh is gathering. The Waaagh, the word that every species in the Warhammer 40,000 galaxy has learned to dread, not simply because of what it announces, but because of what it represents. Not simply a battle cry, not simply a military campaign, not simply the gathering of a force. The Waaagh is the specific expression of what happens when orc society reaches a threshold, when a war boss has become powerful enough, when the green tide has grown large enough, when the collective psychic weight of millions of orcs wanting to fight has built to the specific point where the wanting becomes a force that nothing in the swarm can resist. It is a tide. Once a Waaagh begins in earnest, once the momentum has built to the specific critical mass that the Waaagh field generates, it is not a campaign that can be redirected by tactical necessity or political consideration. It is a biological phenomenon. The orcs within it are not making choices in the conventional sense of selecting between available options. They are expressing the specific purpose they were made for, collectively, at the highest pitch that their species is capable of. Tonight, we follow the mechanics of the Waaagh, how it begins, how it grows, what it produces, and why the galaxy has never found a permanent answer to it. What the war field is. Every Ork generates the Waaagh field simply by existing, not through deliberate effort. The field is a continuous byproduct of Ork biology, produced by the specific neural structure of the Ork brain, and expressed outward into the psychic dimension automatically. A single Ork generates a trivial amount. A warband of 50 Orks generates something measurable. An army of 10,000 Orks generates something that begins to have tangible effects on the material world around them. The psychic field of the Waaagh allows Orks to instinctively recognize who is bigger and therefore in charge. This is the specific social mechanism that makes Ork hierarchy function without formal institutions or written rules. There is no need for titles or elections or succession laws. The largest Ork in any gathering is automatically the one who commands. Not because anyone decided this, but because the Waaagh field makes the recognition automatic. Every Ork in the vicinity simply knows who is biggest and adjusts their behavior accordingly. This automatic recognition is why Ork society is stable despite being organized entirely around violence. In human societies, leadership disputes produce civil war, assassination, political intrigue. In Ork society, leadership disputes produce fights, which produce a clear winner, which produce the automatic recognition that the winner is now the biggest, which produces the specific deference that the Waaagh field generates. The system is brutal and direct and in its own way extremely functional. The Waaagh field warms reality to fit Orkish beliefs. This is the property that makes the Orks theologically and physically extraordinary. If Orks believe their vehicle can go faster, it goes faster. If Orks believe their weapons can destroy what they are pointed at, they destroy it. The field does not override physics in a way that can be measured by outside observers in a controlled environment. It operates in the specific messy conditions of actual Ork use, where the belief and the field and the material reality are simultaneous and inseparable. The red vehicles going faster is the most famous example, but the phenomenon extends to everything the Orks do. Ork armor that looks insufficient protects better than its material properties suggest. Ork weapons that appear crudely constructed cause more damage than their construction implies. Ork bombers that should not be able to achieve altitude somehow do. The gap between what Ork technology should do and what it actually does is the specific space that the Waaagh field fills. The social structure. Ork society is a hierarchy of violence, but it is not a simple one. The specific complexity of the roles that Ork society has developed, roles that emerge from the biological specializations the old ones had built into the species, rather than from conscious cultural development, produces something more organized than a simple pile of fighters hitting each other. The Gretchen, the smallest of the Orkoid species, smaller than a human child, numerous, cowardly in the specific way of something that has learned that being small in Ork society is survivable only through the combination of usefulness and quick reflexes. Gretchen serve as laborers, servants, ammunition carriers, cannon fodder, test subjects for mech boy experiments, and the specific buffer class between the Orks' violence and the things Orks need done but cannot do themselves, because they are busy fighting. The relationship between Orks and Gretchen is not slavery in the formal sense. Gretchen are not property in any legal framework, partly because Ork legal frameworks are not the kind of structures that would recognize property rights. It is more accurately described as the specific relationship between a large creature that can kill the small creature without consequence, and the small creature that has made itself useful enough that the large creature has not gotten around to killing it yet. The Gretchen find this arrangement acceptable because the alternative is death. The mech boys, the specific Ork class, that is biologically predisposed toward technological understanding, not trained, born with the specific neural configuration that makes Mechboy thinking natural. They can look at a broken machine and understand what is wrong with it. They can assemble weapons and vehicles from salvaged parts that should not fit together and produce something that works through the specific combination of their biological gift and the Waaagh field that fills the gaps between the parts and the function. Mechboys occupy a specific position in Ork society that is protected from the normal violence that resolves all other disputes. Killing the Mechboy is possible. Everything in Ork society is possible. But it produces specific consequences. The other Orks recognize, through the same Waaagh field instinct that tells them who is biggest, that the Mechboy is the specific category of Ork that makes the tanks work. Killing the Mechboy is the kind of decision that requires the situation to be extreme enough that the inconvenience of the consequences is worth the satisfaction of the killing. The Weird Boys, the Ork Psychers, beings who absorb the Waaagh field generated by the Orks around them and channel it into specific psychic effects. The specific quality of Ork Psyker experience is different from the human Psyker's relationship to the warp. Weird Boys are not drawing on the warp through a connection that leaves them vulnerable to demonic intrusion. They are drawing on the Waaagh field, the collective psychic energy of the Orks around them, and expressing it through the specific capabilities that the field enables. The danger for Weird Boys is not chaos corruption, it is overload. A Weird Boyer surrounded by too many Orks in the specific conditions of a large Waaagh, where the field is at its most intense, absorbs more psychic energy than the body can contain and produces results that range from spectacular to catastrophic. The specific Ork term for this, their Eds Asplodin, which is accurate. The War Boss, the apex of Ork society, the specific individual who has survived long enough and fought well enough that their biological growth has produced a creature that is measurably and observably bigger than every other Ork in the territory. The War Boss does not administer or organize in the way that human commanders administer and organize. The War Boss fights and the other Orks follow, because the Waaagh field makes following the biggest Ork automatic. The specific quality of War Boss leadership is that it is entirely self-generating. There is no need to claim the position or to perform the specific behaviors that human hierarchies require of their top position. A War Boss who is the biggest Ork is a War Boss. If another Ork becomes bigger, through fighting, through growth, through the specific biological mechanism of Ork development, the hierarchy adjusts automatically. The bigger Ork is the boss. This is all there is. The Waaagh builds. The specific process by which a Waaagh forms is not a linear progression of decisions. It is more accurately described as a cascade, a series of events that each makes the next more likely, building toward the specific threshold at which the momentum becomes self-sustaining. It begins with a War Boss, a specific Ork, who has grown large enough, who has won enough fights, who has accumulated enough followers through the automatic Waaagh field recognition that the biggest Ork commands. Every Ork in the territory follows the biggest Ork. If the biggest Ork is very big and very successful, Orks from adjacent territories begin to be drawn toward them, not through political attraction or ideological alignment, but through the specific psychic gravity of a large Waaagh field, pulling at the smaller fields of the Orks around it. As the War Boss grows, so does the Warband. As the Warband grows, so does the Waaagh field. As the field grows, it draws more Orks. As more Orks arrive, fights happen. Between the new arrivals and the existing Warband, between factions within the growing horde, between everyone and everyone else in the specific way of a species for whom violence is the primary social interaction. These fights produce growth in the survivors. The survivors are bigger. The bigger survivors are more capable of drawing more orcs. The positive feedback loop of orc society operating at scale. More orcs produces more fighting. More fighting produces bigger orcs. Bigger orcs produce a stronger war field. A stronger war field draws more orcs. A sufficiently large war generates something that the war field makes automatic and that no orc can resist. The need to go somewhere and fight something. The specific threshold at which the need becomes irresistible is not measured in the number of orcs or in the strength of the field. It is the qualitative transition from a warband that is gathering to a Waaagh that is moving, from potential energy to kinetic expression. A war boss is an individual orc who is invariably the largest, most dominating, physically intimidating. The war boss is therefore able to unite different warbands of orcs into a horde. This horde is almost always gathered for the purpose and duration of undertaking a Waaagh. Once the Waaagh is moving, it is not simply an army advancing. It is the specific expression of millions of organisms simultaneously fulfilling the purpose they were designed for. The orcs in a Waaagh are not soldiers following orders. They are a biological wave, operating through the specific mechanism of the Waaagh field, expressing the Old One's original design at the scale the design was meant for. What faces a Waaagh? The galaxy's civilizations have been facing orc Waaghs for as long as those civilizations have existed. The Imperium of Man has developed doctrines. The Elder have developed strategies. The Toll have developed tactical approaches. None of these have produced a permanent solution, because the specific nature of the Waaagh as a biological phenomenon, rather than a political or military one, means that it cannot be addressed through the tools that conventional enemies can be addressed with. You can defeat a Waaagh militarily. Killing enough orcs to disrupt the field, killing the war boss whose psychic gravity was pulling the horde together, destroying enough of the specific infrastructure of concentrated orc presence that the momentum cannot sustain itself. These things can break a Waaagh. Temporarily, what they cannot do, address the spores. Every world that a Waaagh has passed through, whether the Waaagh was defeated there or simply moved on, has been seeded with orc spores. The specific reproduction mechanism of the orc species means that the world will produce more orcs. In years, decades, centuries, depending on the environment's specific properties and the density of the original seeding, new orcs will grow from the spores, new warbands will form, new war bosses will emerge from the fighting. The Waaagh field will begin to accumulate again. A Waaagh is typically dispersed at its defeat, the death of its war boss, or simply when it runs out of enemies. The combined warbands and tribes will then break up through infighting and interclan rivalry. But the orcs remain. They always remain. The specific design principle that made the Old One's weapons self-replicating without instruction means that the galaxy's orc population is permanent as long as there are worlds for the spores to grow on. Defeating a Waaagh addresses the specific expression of the problem at that moment. It does not address the problem. The technology of improbability. Orc technology deserves its own specific discussion because it is one of the galaxy's most genuinely unusual phenomena. Not simply crude, improbably functional. The specific combination of mechboy genius and Waaagh field reality adjustment produces weapons and vehicles that should not work and do. The mechboy builds without blueprints. The specific orc technological tradition is not based on engineering principles that can be written down and taught. It is based on the specific biological intuition that mech boys are born with, that allows them to understand what a machine needs to do, and to make it do that thing through the specific combination of available parts and Waaagh field supplementation. The looted wagon is the most visible expression of this. Orks take whatever they can find from defeated enemies, Imperial tanks, Eldar grav vehicles, Tau battlesuits, and incorporate them into Ork military use. The specific process of incorporation involves the mech boy disassembling what was taken, understanding its function in the intuitive way of mech boy understanding, and reassembling it with modifications that make it more orkish. The result is a vehicle that retains some of the original's functionality and gains some properties that the original's designers would not have intended and could not have predicted. Similarly, it is an article of faith among orks that explosives become more powerful the more you add to them. In most engineering contexts, this is true up to a specific point and then produces diminishing returns or outright failure. In ork engineering, it is simply true. The Waaagh field ensures that the belief matches the outcome. The Stomper, the specifically ork walking fortress, the mechanical giant that the mech boys construct when they have sufficient material and sufficient ambition, whose scale and construction violates most principles of structural engineering, and whose battlefield performance violates most principles of what construction like that should be capable of. Stompers walk. They fight. They absorb punishment that would destroy vehicles built on conventional engineering principles. They are powered by principles that the Adeptus Mechanicus would describe as mechanically unsound, and that the Orks would describe as just right. The Death Dread, smaller than a Stomper but embodying the same design philosophy. The Ork equivalent of a Space Marine dreadnought, which is to say an Ork in a walking mechanical shell, whose specific combination of armament and armor and the occupant's enthusiasm produces a battlefield presence significantly larger than its technical specifications should support. Sleep well. 6 more parts remain, and the first major Waaagh against the Imperium is gathering in the warp. The Orks have been fighting the Imperium of Man since the Imperium existed, before the Horus Heresy, before the Great Crusade, before the Emperor walked mankind's worlds and reclaimed what had been lost during the Age of Strife. In the most ancient period of the Imperium's history, when the forces of the Emperor first pushed outward through the galaxy and encountered what was already living there, they found Orks. The Great Crusade did not simply clear human worlds, it cleared Ork worlds. Worlds that had been inhabited by Ork civilizations, using the term loosely because Ork civilization is organized around fighting rather than around the other activities that human civilization associates with the word for thousands of years. Some of those worlds had been held by Orks for longer than humanity had been spacefaring. The Space Marine legions of the Great Crusade fought Waaaghs before the Horus Heresy gave them something worse to fight. Tonight we follow the great Waaaghs of history, the specific events and war bosses whose scale and consequence elevated them above the constant background noise of Ork aggression that the Imperium manages as a permanent feature of existence. The Age of Strife and the Orks. The Age of Strife. The period of approximately 5,000 years between the peak of Old Earth's galactic expansion and the Emperor's emergence, the specific catastrophe of massive warp storms that had cut the worlds of humanity off from each other, that had allowed the alien empires of the galaxy to expand into the spaces that humanity had vacated, that had produced on many worlds the specific horror of human populations without interstellar contact trying to survive in a galaxy full of things that wanted to eat them. The Orks were among those things, not the most sophisticated, or the most strategically directed. The Eldar were still a coherent civilization in this period, and various other Xenos threats had their own agendas. The Orks were simply the most numerous, and their specific property of seeding worlds with spores meant that the Age of Strife had been a period of significant Ork territorial expansion. By the time the Emperor launched the Great Crusade, significant portions of the galaxy that had once been human-settled were Ork-held, not conquered in the political sense of Ork administration replacing human administration. Consumed in the specific Ork sense of the Orks, fighting anything that moved, and growing in the specific conditions of worlds where the only things left to fight were each other. The Space Marine legions cleared worlds, systematic, large-scale military operations to reclaim human space from the Ork presence that the Age of Strife had allowed to develop. The Great Crusade was not simply about finding human worlds and protecting them. A significant component of it was fighting the Ork Waaaghs that had formed in human space during humanity's absence. The Ultramarines under Primarch Guilliman conducted extensive anti-Ork campaigns in what would become Ultramar. The specific operations that established the 500 worlds of Ultramar as the Imperium's most organized and most prosperous region required clearing those worlds of the Ork populations that had accumulated in them during the Age of Strife. The War of the Beast, M32, the largest Waaagh in recorded history. 1,000 years after the Horus Heresy, in approximately the 32nd millennium, an Ork war boss of unprecedented scale emerged, known only as the Beast, because the Orks who served him were too afraid to speak his name, which was the specific measure of how large he had grown. This war boss had achieved something that had never happened before and has not been replicated since. He was intelligent. Not Ork intelligent, which is to say brutally effective in combat and cunning in the specific way of a creature that has spent its entire life fighting. Genuinely, strategically, politically intelligent. Capable of the kind of complex multi-theater military planning that human generals spent years learning, operating across a campaign scale that required coordinating dozens of Waaaghs simultaneously, maintaining the specific strategic coherence across a conflict that would normally have fragmented into independent Ork aggression at the first opportunity. The Beast's Waaagh attacked the Imperium on multiple fronts simultaneously. Not the usual Ork behavior of a single Waaagh following a single direction until it ran out of enemies. A coordinated multi-front offensive that struck at the Imperium's most critical systems, including Terra itself. Attack Moon. The specific weapon that the Beast deployed against Terra was one of the most extraordinary pieces of engineering in Ork history. A space station the size of a small moon, propelled through the warp by the specific application of Ork mechboy genius at its absolute apex, that appeared in Terra's orbit and opened a warp gate directly over the throne world. The warp gate over Terra, the most sacred and most defended world in the Imperium, the location of the Golden Throne, and the Emperor's life-sustaining mechanism, attacked through the specific vector of an Ork moon that had travelled through the warp to appear directly above it. The Adeptus Custodes, the Emperor's personal guard, the finest warriors the Imperium possessed, found themselves fighting Orks in the streets of the Imperial Palace itself. The Imperium nearly fell. This is not hyperbole. The War of the Beast, in its most critical period, was an existential crisis, not the slow existential crisis of the heresy's aftermath, but the immediate existential crisis of a Waaagh large enough to threaten the throne world itself. The Beast was eventually killed through a specific operation that involved a Space Marine chapter master and sacrifices whose scale matched the threat they were addressing. His death dispersed the Waaagh in the way that a war boss's death disperses a Waaagh. Quickly, completely, as the specific psychic gravity that had been holding the combined horde together dissolved. The intelligence question. The beast's specific intelligence, the strategic coherence that had made his Waaagh qualitatively different from every other Waaagh in history, was not simply a matter of one unusually large orc. The lore surrounding the beast suggests that his intelligence was connected to the specific scale of the Waaagh field he generated, that at a sufficient size, the collective psychic energy of millions of orcs could produce in their warboss something approaching genuine strategic genius, the specific emergent property of the field at its most concentrated. Whether this is reproducible, whether another orc could grow to the beast's specific size and intelligence through a similar accumulation of victories and followers, is one of the galaxy's most carefully maintained anxieties. The War of the Beast demonstrated that the Orks were capable of a threat level that the Imperium had not prepared for. The question of whether it was a unique event or the specific outcome of conditions that could recur has never been fully answered. The Charadon Empire. The exception to the rule that Waaaghs disperse when their warboss dies or when they run out of enemies. A particularly dominant warboss occasionally manages to hold his boys together, forging a small empire for himself. The best example of this is the Orc Empire of Charadon. It survived for thousands of years under the rule of successive warlords, a rarity of organization for the Orcs. Charadon is the galaxy's longest surviving Orc political entity. Not a Waaagh in the standard sense. A structured territorial domain with a succession of war bosses who had managed to maintain enough personal authority and institutional coherence that the empire persisted across generations of leadership, rather than dispersing at each leader's death. How Charadon maintained this unusual stability is not fully explained in the lore. The most plausible reading involves the specific combination of a territory that provided continuous military activity, constant small conflicts that kept the Orcs fighting and growing without requiring the specific mobilization that a full Waaagh demanded, and a succession mechanism that preserved enough organizational continuity between rulers to prevent the complete dissolution that normally follows a war boss's death. Arch-Arsonist of Charadon. The war boss title that identified the ruler of the Charadon Empire in the period most relevant to the game's narrative present. A being of considerable power, whose specific conflict with the Imperium's Segmentum Solar had been ongoing for long enough to be a permanent feature of the regional military landscape, rather than a crisis requiring specific response. The Orc invasion of Ulanor, the Ulanor Crusade. The specific event from the Great Crusade era that was, at the time, the single largest military operation in the Imperium's history. Horus was awarded the title of War Master in its aftermath, the highest military honor the Emperor could bestow, given at the triumphant conclusion of what had been the most demanding campaign of the Crusade. The Orc Empire centered on Ulanor was led by warboss Uruk, the largest and most powerful Orc encountered during the Great Crusade, whose Waaagh had grown to a scale that required the Emperor himself to be present for the operation's direction. The combined forces of multiple Space Marine legions, under the unified command that the Emperor's presence made possible, converged on Ulanor and destroyed the Orc Empire that had been building there. The specific significance of Ulanor. It demonstrated the scale that Orc military power could achieve, even within the Imperium's earliest history. The Great Crusade had been clearing Orc-held worlds from its beginning. At Ulanor, it encountered the Orc equivalent of an empire, a territorial domain comparable in scale to the Imperium itself at that period, organized around a war boss of sufficient power, that his mere survival across the campaigns that had preceded the Crusade implied capabilities that exceeded the norm. Destroying the Ulanor Empire required the Emperor's personal involvement, not because the legions were insufficient. The assembled might of the Space Marine legions was the most powerful military force humanity had ever deployed, because the scale of what needed to be coordinated, the specific complexity of fighting an Ork empire that had been building for decades and had developed the particular resilience of something that had survived that long, required the kind of strategic direction that only the Emperor could provide. The Waaagh Planet's Masha 977.M41. Big Mech Fragrak the Planet's Masha made a specific vow to surpass all other Death Skulls by looting an entire world. Not taking what was on the world and leaving, taking the world itself. He jerry-rigged a combination of tractor beams, ram ships, and city-sized rocket boosters to push the third moon of Torabrax out of its orbit, directly onto a collision course with its parent world. The resultant catastrophe rendered all life on the thriving Imperial hive world extinct, fracturing continents, boiling the oceans off into space, and burning away the world's atmosphere, finally reducing Torabrax to a drifting debris field. This is one of the most specific expressions of the Ork approach to the galaxy's problems in the entire 41st millennium. The problem: how do you loot a planet? The solution: you crash a moon into it and sort through the debris. The outcome: an inhabited hive world with billions of residents is destroyed. The Ork assessment of this: successful looting. The specific casualness of this event in the Ork timeline is itself the most disturbing thing about it. Waaagh Planet's Masha is listed alongside dozens of other Ork military actions in the canonical records. It is not a unique atrocity in the Ork tradition. It is the specific category of Ork achievement, the particularly innovative application of the Ork genius for destruction, that produces a footnote in the Administratum's records of regional disasters. The Lost Waaagh 978.M41. An entire Waaagh disappeared. The Lost Waaagh entered the warp in the Ultima Segmentum and never emerged. No trace of it has ever been found. The specific scale of this absence: not a small warband, not a regional force. A Waaagh, with all that implies in terms of numbers and ships, and the specific psychic weight of a large Ork military force. Gone. The warp had taken something of that size, and there was no record of where it had gone or what had happened to it. Whether the Lost War was destroyed by the warp, consumed by the specific dangers of warp travel that the Orks had always approached with more enthusiasm than preparation, or whether it emerged somewhere else in the galaxy, at a different time, in a different context than the one it had entered from, is unknown. The specific anxiety this produces is the knowledge that a Waaagh of that scale could be anywhere, could emerge at any time, could arrive in a system that had no knowledge it was coming, with no warning at all. It is one of the galaxy's permanently open questions. The Lost Waaagh, somewhere possibly still in the warp, possibly having emerged in a time and place that has not been identified as its origin. Still a Waaagh, if Ork biology functions in the warp in the way it functions in real space. Still looking for something to fight. Sleep well. 5 more parts remain. And Ghazghkull has just received a vision from Gork and Mork. Ghazghkull Mag Uruk Thraka, the name that every Imperial commander in the 41st millennium has learned to say with the specific weight that names acquire when they have been attached to catastrophes. The self-proclaimed prophet of the Waaagh, the Beast of Armageddon, the most notorious war boss of the current age, not simply the largest or the most powerful, though he is among the largest and the most powerful, but the specific combination of physical capability, unusual cunning, and theological conviction that has made him something more than a war boss. He is convinced that Gork and Mork have chosen him, not in the vague way that all war bosses who have survived long enough begin to believe they have divine favor, in the specific, detailed, vision-informed way of a being who has received direct psychic communication from his gods, and who has built his entire subsequent existence around the specific mission that communication revealed. Whether the gods actually spoke to him, whether Gork and Mork are real in the specific sense that divine entities in the Warhammer universe can be real, or whether Ghazghkull's conviction is the specific product of Ork psychology amplified by his unusual intelligence, is one of the questions that the 40K universe's setting treats with productive ambiguity. The gods exist, their influence is real. Whether Ghazghkull is genuinely their prophet, or the galaxy's most dangerous enthusiast who has convinced himself he is their prophet, the practical distinction may not matter. Tonight we follow Ghazghkull from his unlikely beginning to his current status as the most dangerous Ork alive. The injury that made him. Ghazghkull was not always exceptional. He was a Goth warrior, the clan most associated with direct, brutal close-quarters combat. The Orks, who painted themselves black and prided themselves on hitting harder than anyone and letting nothing stop them. He was large for a Goth warrior and presumably capable, but not the specific being whose name would eventually become synonymous with planetary devastation. A bolter shell to the head nearly killed him. The specific projectile of Imperial firearms, the mass reactive shells that detonate inside their targets, had done exactly what it was designed to do to Ghazghkull's skull. The damage was severe enough that survival was not expected. Enter Mad Doc Grotznik, the Ork surgeon, using the term surgeon loosely, because Ork medicine involves the same relationship to conventional medical practice that Ork engineering involves to conventional engineering, who was present and who had a specific philosophy about the relationship between structural modification and enhancement. Grotznik's practice was not to heal wounds, but to improve on them. The specific Ork medical tradition of pain boys, the surgeons who served as both doctors and experimental engineers, had produced in Grotznik a specific refinement, the belief that a sufficiently advanced procedure could take whatever the injury had left and produce something better than what had existed before. He replaced the damaged portions of Ghazghkull's skull with adamantium, not simply as a structural repair. Adamantium is the hardest material available in the Warhammer universe, a replacement that made Ghazghkull's head capable of withstanding punishment that would have ended any other Ork. He also, in the process of the surgery, modified the brain in ways that the lore describes as being connected to the bionics, but that produced effects that went beyond simple structural repair. Whatever Grotznik did to Ghazghkull's brain, the result was that Ghazghkull awoke from the surgery with a vision. Gork and Mork themselves had appeared to him in the specific form that Ork divine revelation takes. Not subtle, not symbolic, direct and overwhelming and organized around a specific message. Ghazghkull was chosen. He was to lead the greatest Waaagh in history. He was the prophet of the Waaagh, and whole worlds would burn in his bootprints. He possessed a considerable measure of cunning, and in battle he tends to focus more on commanding his troops compared to other war bosses, only engaging in combat himself at critical moments. This specific behavior, the willingness to hold back from direct combat in order to direct the battle from a command position, was already unusual in an Ork. War bosses are expected to fight. The biggest Ork is the boss, and the biggest Ork's position at the front of every engagement is a significant component of how Ork authority functions. An Ork war boss who held back to observe and direct rather than to personally pulverize would, in most Ork contexts, be questioned. Ghazghkull's specific genius was that his intelligence, the specific mental capacity that Grotznik's surgery had somehow produced or amplified, expressed itself in the particular understanding that a war boss who survived was a war boss who could continue to build the Waaaghs, and a war boss who was killed in a fight that his subordinates could have won without him was a war boss who had died for no reason. This was not cowardice. When Ghazghkull fought personally, he fought with the specific ferocity of an Ork who had grown through decades of combat and whose adamantium skull made him nearly impossible to kill through the head attacks that felled most Orks. He was devastating in direct combat. He chose, specifically and deliberately, not to use that capability unless it was the decisive factor in a situation his Orks could not otherwise resolve. An Ork who thought tactically about when to deploy himself as a weapon. This was something the galaxy had not encountered before. The first war for Armageddon. Armageddon. The industrial world in the segmentum solar. Densely populated, extensively fortified, covered in the specific urban industrial landscape of a hive world that had been producing Imperial war material for centuries. A world of strategic significance. A world that the Imperium valued beyond its specific resources because of its position and its population, and the specific symbol that holding it represented. Ghazghkull came for it in 941. M41. The first war for Armageddon, though it was not called that until subsequent events made the numbering necessary. The invasion demonstrated what had changed about Ork military action when Ghazghkull was leading it. The Waaagh did not simply arrive and fight in the specific undirected way of most Ork invasions. It was organized. The specific timing of assaults on different parts of Armageddon's defenses was coordinated, not in the way of human military coordination, with explicit orders and communications infrastructure, but through the specific mechanism of Ghazghkull's personal authority radiating through the Waaagh field and producing something approaching coherent direction. Only the vast military experience and leadership of Commissar Sebastian Yarrick prevented the world from falling to the Orks within the first solar month of conflict. Space Marine reinforcements gradually turned the tide of the war, and Ghazghkull retreated to the Golgotha sector to lick his wounds and plot his revenge. Sebastian Yarrick, the Commissar who would become as famous as Ghazghkull himself, whose specific combination of personal courage and tactical skill had been what held Armageddon together in the critical early period of the invasion. He had lost a hand in combat with Ghazghkull, the specific detail that the law preserves. Ghazghkull allowed Yarrick to keep the hand rather than consuming it, out of the specific respect that the war boss was developing for the human commander who had made him work for every meter of ground. The relationship between Ghazghkull and Yarrick is one of the more unusual character dynamics in the 40K universe. A mutual respect between opponents who had both made the other more dangerous by being worthy of their best. Ghazghkull specifically freed Yarrick from imprisonment rather than killing him, sending him back to the Imperium so that he could lead the defense that Ghazghkull intended to overcome. The specific honor of wanting to defeat a worthy opponent rather than simply eliminating an obstacle. The Second War for Armageddon, 999 M41. Ghazghkull returned. 57 years after the First War, with a Waaagh that had been building in the Golgotha sector across those decades, Ghazghkull came back to the world that had cost him so much and that he had been thinking about ever since. The Second War for Armageddon is one of the most extensively documented military operations in the 41st millennium's history, not because of its specific outcome. The Imperium held Armageddon again at enormous cost, but because of the specific quality of the conflict. Ghazghkull had been thinking for 57 years, not continuously. Orks do not have the human capacity for prolonged abstract strategic contemplation, but in the specific practical sense of returning to a problem repeatedly, of trying different approaches in the dozens of smaller campaigns the Waaagh had conducted in the Golgotha sector during those decades, of developing through actual combat experience a more refined version of the approach that had almost worked the first time. The scale of the Second War dwarfed the first. The Waaagh that descended on Armageddon was larger by an order of magnitude. The specific military operations were more coordinated. The targeting of specific Imperial defensive assets, the communications infrastructure, the command hierarchy, the specific installations whose destruction would most impair the coordinated response, reflected the specific kind of tactical thinking that human commanders would recognize as deliberate rather than instinctive. Yarrick was there again, older, bionic armed, carrying the specific psychological weight of the First War and the specific determination of someone who had spent 57 years knowing that Ghazghkull was coming back. He had been arguing for Armageddon's reinforcement throughout the interim period. He had not been believed as urgently as the situation warranted. The war lasted years, not a swift invasion that was rapidly repelled. A sustained grinding conflict across the surface of an entire hive world, with the massive conurbations that covered Armageddon, becoming the specific terrain of urban warfare at the largest possible scale. Hive cities as fortresses, ash wastes as the specific killing grounds between them. The Imperium held, but the holding cost something specific. The world that emerged from the Second War for Armageddon was not the world that had gone into it. The population had been devastated. The industrial infrastructure was damaged in ways that would take decades to repair. The specific social and political structure of the world had been transformed by the emergency measures and the military occupation that the war had required. And Ghazghkull did not stay. He withdrew, not because he was defeated in the specific sense of being driven from the field, but because the world he had come for had served its purpose. He had fought the fight he had come to fight. The specific satisfaction of a Waaagh that had expressed itself at its full scale was apparently what he had needed from Armageddon. And with that expression completed, he turned towards something larger. What Ghazghkull was building toward. The specific intelligence that distinguished Ghazghkull from other war bosses expressed itself most clearly in his stated long-term goal. He did not want to hold Armageddon. He did not want to build a permanent Ork empire in the Segmentum Solar. He wanted the greatest Waaagh in the galaxy's history, something that exceeded even the Beast campaign in scale and scope. I'm Warlord Ghazghkull Mag Uruk Thraka, and I speak with the word of the gods. I'm the prophet of the Waaagh, and whole worlds burn in my boot prints. The prophecy he had received from Gork and Mork, whatever it was, whatever the specific content of the vision that Grotznik's surgery had somehow facilitated, was organized around scale. The greatest Waaagh, not the best Waaagh in the current age, not the biggest Waaagh since the Beast, the greatest Waaagh ever. The specific ambition of a being who had been told by his gods that he was chosen for the ultimate expression of what the Ork species was. Whether this was achievable, whether the specific conditions that the Beast had achieved, the scale of Waaagh that had put a moon over Terra, could be recreated, was an open question. The beast had been intelligent in ways that went beyond Ghazghkull's specific cunning. But Ghazghkull was alive and growing and building, and the beast had been dead for 9 millennia, and the galaxy of the 41st millennium was more chaotic and more vulnerable than the galaxy of the 32nd had been. The conditions for something unprecedented were developing. Makari the Grot. No account of Ghazghkull would be complete without Makari. The Gretchen, the small, green, perpetually terrified servant who had been attached to Ghazghkull for as long as anyone could reliably track, was the specific individual who had received the psychic vision of Ork origins that provided the most detailed account of the Krorks and the war in heaven. Makari's specific characteristic: survival. Gretchen died constantly in Ork environments, consumed by the casual violence of a society in which the biggest can kill the smallest without consequence. Makari had been with Ghazghkull through multiple campaigns, through the 2 wars for Armageddon, through dozens of smaller conflicts, and had survived each of them. Whether Makari's survival was luck, the specific divine protection of being attached to the prophet of the Waaagh, or some personal quality that made the Gretchen too useful to be killed, the outcome was the same. Makari had seen more of Ghazghkull's campaign than any other living being. The specific experiences that the Gretchen had processed, and the specific psychic vision that the prophet had apparently shared in some way, made Makari the unique repository of Ghazghkull's history from the inside. The banner of Makari, the war banner that Makari carried for Ghazghkull, the specific symbol of the prophet's authority that his personal Gretchen had been waving in every battle since the beginning, was eventually found without Makari attached to it. The Gretchen had apparently been killed, definitively, finally, after surviving so much, and a new Gretchen had immediately taken up the banner and continued waving it. Whether this new Gretchen was simply a replacement, or whether the specific continuity of the banner-waving function had been maintained in some way that the Ork tradition did not distinguish from the literal continuation of the same individual. The law allows both and does not resolve the distinction. Sleep well. 4 more parts remain, and the 3rd war for Armageddon is beginning. 998 M41. 1 year before the 13th Black Crusade. 1 year before Cadia fell, and the Great Rift split the galaxy, and everything changed. Ghazghkull returned to Armageddon for the 3rd time. The 3rd war for Armageddon. The conflict that would become, in the context of everything that followed, the last of the old style of catastrophe. The last great crisis before the new style of catastrophe, when crises became permanent features of the galactic landscape rather than events with beginnings and potential endings. Ghazghkull had been building. The decades since the Second War had been spent in the Golgotha sector and beyond, growing the Waaagh in the specific patient way of an Ork, who understood that the next step required more than what the last step had brought. More Orks, more ships, more mech boy work, more fights to produce more growth in the survivors. The specific accumulation of the elements that made a Waaagh the size he was aiming for possible. When he came back to Armageddon, he came with the largest Ork force yet assembled in the 41st millennium. Not the beast scale. The specific conditions that had produced the beast's strategic genius remained unique, but a Waaagh of a scale that required the Imperium to respond at a level it had not previously committed. What made the Third War different? Yarrick was waiting, not as a surprise. Ghazghkull had known Yarrick would be there, and Yarrick had known Ghazghkull would return, and the specific quality of a conflict between two beings who had studied each other across multiple wars and decades of mutual professional respect was present from the beginning. The Adepta Sororitas, the Sisters of Battle, the military arm of the ecclesiarchy, the specifically religious warriors whose faith was expressed through combat capability, were among the forces defending Armageddon during the Third War. Their presence added a specific theological dimension to a conflict that already had theological dimensions on the Ork side through Ghazghkull's prophetic conviction. Space Marines from dozens of chapters, the Black Templars, who had a specific history of fighting Orks that stretched back to the founding of their chapter in the aftermath of the heresy, the Salamanders, the Blood Angels, the Ultramarines, the specific gathering of Astartes forces that the Third War required was one of the largest multi-chapter deployments since the heresy. The specific battle for Armageddon was fought across the same terrain that had been fought over twice before. The hive cities, the ash wastes, the industrial infrastructure that made the world both strategically valuable and tactically complex. But the scale was larger, and the specific innovations that Ghazghkull had developed in the Golgotha sector were visible in how the Waaagh operated. Coordinated drops, multiple simultaneous landing zones that overwhelmed the defender's ability to respond to any single point without leaving others vulnerable. The specific operational logic of an attack that was designed to produce the maximum confusion in the defense by being impossible to address comprehensively. Not the single thrust assault of the First War, not the more organized multi-front approach of the Second, but something approaching genuine operational art. The conflict was ongoing, not resolved. When the 13th Black Crusade arrived and Cadia fell and the Great Rift opened, while the Third War for Armageddon was still being fought, the Imperium found itself in the specific situation of managing a catastrophe, while an existing catastrophe had not yet been resolved. The Great Rift changed Armageddon's strategic context. The system found itself in a region of the galaxy that was now disrupted by the warp storms that the Rift had generated, where Imperial navigation had become unreliable, where reinforcement and resupply were more difficult. The Third War for Armageddon did not simply end because the galaxy changed around it. It continued, in a changed context, with changed strategic parameters, as a conflict that had been ongoing for years before the Rift arrived, and that continued as one of many crises in the new configuration. The mutual kill and what followed, Ragnar Blackmane, the Space Wolf who eventually, in the specific way of the setting's most dramatic individual confrontations, found himself in direct combat with Ghazghkull during the Third War's most critical engagements, off with his head. On the receiving end courtesy of a mutual kill between Ghazghkull and Ragnar Blackmane. Thanks to his ridiculously tough Ork physiology and Grotznik's surgery, he got better. The decapitation of a war boss should end a war. The war boss's death removes the specific psychic gravity that was holding the Horde together. And without that gravity, the Horde disperses into the infighting and interclan rivalry that is Ork society's default state. Ghazghkull's head and body were separated. Grotznik was present. The specific surgery that had already rebuilt Ghazghkull's skull from the original injury had produced a body that was, in the specific ways that mattered, more durable than any standard Ork physiology. The surgery to reattach the head and restart the systems that decapitation had interrupted was not simple, but it was possible in the specific way that Mad Dog Grotznik's approach made seemingly impossible medical interventions possible. Ghazghkull was rebuilt. Again, as he had been rebuilt after the original injury, he emerged from Grotznik's surgery larger than he had entered it. The specific property of Ork biology that produced growth in response to extreme physical trauma had been activated by the decapitation and reconstruction in the most extreme possible form. The Ghazghkull who emerged was not simply repaired, he was enhanced. He left Armageddon. This is the specific outcome that the Third War produced in its most important individual thread. The prophet of the Waaagh, having survived decapitation through the specific combination of Ork biology and Grotznik's genius, determined that Armageddon had given him what he came for, and that the larger mission required his presence elsewhere. The Third War for Armageddon continued without him. The Ork forces he had assembled did not simply disperse in his absence. The specific scale of the Waaagh he had built, and the specific presence of enough large and capable Ork commanders within it that the field did not immediately collapse, meant that the fighting continued as a sustained conflict rather than dissolving into infighting. But Ghazghkull was gone, moving towards something he had been planning for longer than the Third War had been going on. The era, Indomitus, and the growing threat. The Great Rift changed everything for every faction in the galaxy. For the Orks, the change was not straightforwardly bad. The disruption of the Imperium's communications, the isolation of worlds from reinforcement, the specific chaos of multiple simultaneous crises overwhelming the Imperium's institutional capacity. All of these conditions were, from the Ork perspective, improvements to the fighting environment. More confusion meant more fights. More isolation meant more worlds that could be attacked without immediate response. The Great Rift did not create Ork aggression. Ork aggression existed independently of any external conditions, but it modified the specific conditions in which that aggression operated in ways that favored the Orks' approach to conflict. The Indomitus Crusade, Guilliman's massive military mobilization, the deployment of Primaris Space Marines across the fractured Imperium, the re-establishment of contact with isolated worlds, the systematic effort to address the crises that the Great Rift had generated, encountered Ork forces at multiple points, not simply as incidental contacts, but as significant obstacles that required specific military responses. The Vigilus campaign, one of the Indomitus Crusade's most significant operations, fought in a system that had become a critical transit point between the Imperium's two halves. Vigilus was being contested by multiple factions simultaneously: Chaos Forces, Genestealer cults, and a specific Ork faction called the Speedwaaghh. The Speedwaaghh. The Ork War on Vigilus was not the conventional ground assault style associated with Ghazghkull or most war bosses. It was organized around speed, the specific evil sun's enthusiasm for fast vehicles expressed at Waaagh scale. Fast bikes, fast walkers, fast vehicles of every type, covering enormous distances across Vigilus's landscape with the specific speed that the Waaagh field enabled. Ghazghkull arrived at Vigilus, not for the Speedwaaghh, as a visitor, in the specific way of a war boss who had somewhere else to be and was stopping to evaluate a situation in passing. The specific encounter between Ghazghkull and the Vigilus situation was not a commitment to the campaign there, but a demonstration that the Prophet's attention was distributed across a wider strategic theatre than any single world. The Fourth Tyrannic War and Ork involvement. The Fourth Tyrannic War. High Fleet Leviathan's assault on the Segmentum Pacificus that Space Marine 2 is set in involved Ork forces in the specific way that large-scale Tyranid invasions tend to involve Orks, not as allies, not as coordinated combatants fighting toward a shared objective, but as the specific complication of another powerful faction being present in the same theatre. Orks fought Tyranids. Tyranids fought Orks. The specific exchange rates of these conflicts produced outcomes that neither faction had planned for. Orks were consumed. Tyranids were slowed by the specific resilience of Ork biology, and the Waaagh field's effects on combat, and the galaxy's two most numerous military species made parts of the Segmentum Pacificus even more inhospitable than they would have been if only one catastrophe was occurring. The Tyranids could not consume Ork worlds fully without addressing the spores. Ork spores in a world's soil were not biomass in the conventional sense that the Hive Fleet could simply harvest. They would eventually produce more Orks, which would produce more fighting, which would continue to cost the Hive Fleet organisms in the specific way that Ork resistance was more sustained than most conventional military opposition. From the Ork perspective, the Tyranids were simply a fight, the specific horror that the Tyranids represented for humanity, the existential dread of a species whose explicit purpose was consumption, whose victory would mean the literal end of existence, was not a concept that Ork psychology was structured to produce. The Tyranids were green food fighting back. This was interesting. The Octarius War. Among the most significant conflicts of the 41st Millennium's final years, a conflict that did not involve the Imperium directly, but that had enormous consequences for the galaxy. Inquisitor Kryptman's Gambit, the Inquisitor who had spent his career studying Tyranids, who had made the specific argument that the Hive Fleets were the most significant existential threat, and who had been willing to commit exterminatus on worlds to deny them biomass, had redirected a Tyranid Hive Fleet toward Ork-held space. The specific reasoning: Orks would fight Tyranids. The Tyranids would consume biomass. The Orks would cost the Tyranids more organisms than human defenders. The Tyranids would be weakened. The Orks might be consumed, or the Orks might grow in response to fighting the Tyranids and become larger and stronger. The specific outcome: both. The Octarius War produced the largest sustained Ork-Tyranid conflict in recorded history across multiple worlds in the Octarius sector. Orks grew larger and stronger from fighting the Tyranids. Tyranids consumed Ork biomass and incorporated it. Both factions became more dangerous through the conflict, in the specific way that things that grow stronger from fighting became more capable through a prolonged engagement with something that matched or exceeded their capability. The Tyranid forces that eventually emerged from the Octarius sector were larger and had incorporated Ork genetic material. The Orks that survived and dispersed from the conflict were larger and had fought something that had made them grow at rates that normal conflict did not produce. Kryptman's Gambit had redirected a threat and created a different, potentially larger threat. Whether this was acceptable from the Imperium's strategic perspective, whether the weakened Tyranids were worth the enhanced Orks, was a question that Kryptman's excommunication suggested the Inquisition's answer to. Sleep well. 3 more parts remain, and Ghazghkull is heading towards something unprecedented. We have followed the great events, the Waaaghs, the wars, the specific individuals whose actions shaped the galaxy's relationship to the Ork species across millennia. Tonight we step back from the events and look at the society, the specific structure of how Orks actually live, when they are not in the middle of the largest military operations in galactic history, and what that structure reveals about the species the Old Ones built. Because the Orks are not simply a military force, they are a civilization, an unusual civilization, one that is organized around violence in a way that human civilization is not, but a civilization that has its own specific culture and its own specific art and its own specific economy and its own specific relationship to the divine. Understanding what Ork society looks like from the inside, how Orks relate to each other, what they value, what their daily existence produces in the spaces between the fighting, is essential to understanding why the Ork species is as persistent and as resilient as it has been for 60 million years. The economy of teeth. Orks use teeth as currency. Their own teeth, not the teeth of enemies. The specific continuously regrowing biological structures that every ork produces as a natural byproduct of being an ork. The economic logic of a currency that is produced by every member of the population, that is renewable, that is difficult to counterfeit, because ork teeth have specific properties that make distinguishing genuine from fake relatively straightforward, even for beings who are not known for careful attention to detail. The specific reason that Bad Moons are the wealthiest clan. They regrow teeth faster. The biological quirk that makes Bad Moons richer than other clans is not intelligence or industriousness or any quality that human economic analysis would recognize as a driver of wealth accumulation. It is the specific rate at which their teeth grow, which produces more currency faster, which allows them to buy better equipment, which allows them to win more fights, which allows them to grow larger, which produces more teeth faster. The circular economy of ork wealth. Teeth buy equipment, equipment wins fights, fights produce growth, growth produces more teeth. The specific Bad Moon's position in this cycle, entering it with a naturally higher teeth production rate, is the origin of their status as the wealthy clan. Ork shops, the specific institutions that orks use for commerce, are not shops in the human sense of carefully organized retail environments with fixed prices and customer service. They are more accurately described as the specific outcome of a mech boy or pain boy or other ork specialist setting up in a location and being approached by other orks who want what the specialist has. Prices are negotiated through the specific mechanism of the ork economy, which is to say, through the combination of teeth offered and the threat of violence that any ork brings to any negotiation. The market is cleared by the same mechanism that everything in ork society is cleared. Whoever is bigger gets what they want for the price they want to pay, and the smaller party accepts this or fights, and the outcome of the fight determines the new price. What orks do when they are not fighting. The specific assumption about orks, that they are simply violence waiting to express itself, that their existence between battles is simply a waiting state, is inaccurate. Orks have a rich culture. It is a culture organized around violence and competition in ways that human culture is not, but it has its own art, its own music, its own humor, its own specific approach to the questions that all cultures eventually develop around. Ork art. The specific aesthetic that orks produce, the paintings on vehicles, the decoration of weapons, the flags and banners and personal markings that distinguish one ork's possessions from another's, expresses a specific visual vocabulary. Aggressive, colorful, often asymmetric, organized around the specific imagery of violence and strength and the specific ork divine tradition of Gork and Mork. The face motif. Ork art frequently features an enormous grinning face, all teeth and eyes, the specific visual expression of what orks find beautiful. The face is their own face, idealized. It represents the specific quality of being an ork at its most fully expressed. Big, dangerous, happy. The Goth clan's specific aesthetic is the most stripped down expression of this. Black with minimal ornamentation, the pure martial character without the decorative excess that other clans favor. Bad Moons paint yellow, Evil Suns paint red, Death Skulls paint blue. The specific color traditions of each clan are not arbitrary aesthetic choices. They are expressions of the clan's specific values and character translated into visual form. Red for speed, blue for luck, yellow for wealth. The colors signal what the clan is for, who they are. what the war field connects them to in terms of the specific divine tradition that each clan emphasizes. Music. Orcs produce music, not in the specific way that human musical traditions produce music, with formal composition and performance, and the specific institutional context of concerts and recordings. Orc music is produced by the specific combination of instruments that mech boys build, and the noise that large numbers of orcs generate when they are working toward combat. It is extremely loud. It is extremely percussive. It is, by most non-orc standards, not music in any recognizable sense. To the orcs, it is the specific sound of the Waaagh building, the drums and the metallic noise and the specific sonic environment of a gathering orc war band is both cultural expression and practical mechanism. The noise contributes to the Waaagh field. The field amplifies the noise's effects, and the specific feedback loop of orc collective sonic experience is both art and religion simultaneously. The Pain Boys and the medical tradition. Orc medicine is one of the most genuinely strange aspects of the species culture. Not strange in the sense of primitive or ineffective. Orc surgery produces results that exceed what the materials and methods involved should be capable of, through the specific combination of Pain Boy biological understanding and the Waaagh field that makes orc medical interventions more functional than they should be. The Pain Boy, the orc surgeon, who has developed, through the specific biological predisposition to medical practice that some orcs are born with, an approach to fixing other orcs that is simultaneously terrifying and effective. The patient is usually conscious. The tools are usually not sterile in any conventional sense. The procedures are often performed in the middle of ongoing violence. The outcomes are, by any reasonable expectation, better than they should be. Pain Boys have the specific status in Orc society that Mech Boys have, protected by the recognition that their specific function serves the whole warband. Difficult to kill casually, because the consequences of killing the one who fixes the wounded are visible and immediate. They are also, in the specific way of beings who have been given access to other beings' bodies and who have developed their own theories about what those bodies should look like, enthusiastic experimenters. The Doc's Squig Herder, the specific assistant that Pain Boys frequently employ. Smaller orc servants whose function is to retrieve the specific biological components that Pain Boy procedures require, which frequently includes fetching things from the bodies of other orcs during ongoing surgery. The Squig Herder's job security is directly connected to how useful they are and how quickly they can retrieve things, because a Pain Boy in the middle of a procedure who does not have what they need will use whatever is closest, including the Squig Herder. The specific medical innovations that Pain Boys have produced, driven by the specific combination of genuine surgical curiosity and the complete absence of any ethical constraint on what surgery can be attempted, include the bionic skulls demonstrated by Ghazghkull, various forms of limb enhancement, and the specific class of orc that Pain Boy experimentation produces called cyborgs. The cyborg is an orc who has had sufficient bionic components added that the boundary between biological orc and mechanical enhancement has been largely replaced by the specific combination of both. The Gretchen and their place. The Gretchen, the smaller orcoid species that serves as Orc society's labor class, cannon fodder, experimental subjects, and the specific category of being that exists at the bottom of every hierarchy the Orcs have developed, are not simply victims. They have their own specific culture, their own specific hierarchy among themselves, their own specific relationship to the violence that surrounds them. Gretchen are cowardly, not as a character flaw, as the specific evolutionary adaptation of a species that is smaller and weaker than everything else in its environment, and that it has survived by being very good at not being where the danger is. Gretchen cowardice is so reliable that it has become a feature of Ork military tactics. Gretchen Runthards, the specific Ork role dedicated to forcing Gretchen forward, rather than allowing them to flee, exist because without specific external coercion, the Gretchen's reliable cowardice would make them militarily useless. With specific external coercion, with Runthards behind them and Orks in front of them, Gretchen are extremely useful. They are fast. They can fire at things with the specific accuracy of beings whose primary survival mechanism includes knowing when to shoot and when to run, which produces a form of combat competence that the larger Orks lack the specific motivation to develop. They can operate in spaces too small for full Orks. They can carry things. They can be sent ahead to trigger traps. The Gretchen Runthards tool, the Grot Prod, an electric rod that produces specific amounts of pain when applied to a Gretchen's posterior. The Runthards' job is to be between the Gretchen and their retreat, applying the Grot Prod as necessary, producing the specific situation where the Gretchen calculates that the direction with the enemy in it is less immediately painful than the direction with the Runthard in it. This calculation is accurate as long as the enemy is far enough away. When the enemy is close, the Gretchen abandons the calculation entirely and uses the specific mobility that their small size provides to find somewhere that contains neither enemy nor Runthard. Squigs. Perhaps the most genuinely endearing aspect of Ork culture, the squig. The specific biological life form that Ork civilization has developed a comprehensive relationship with, that serves in functions ranging from food to weapon, to pet to musical instrument. Squigs are small, round, aggressive creatures that are biologically related to the Orks, a byproduct of the same fungal spore mechanism that produces new Orks. Squigs grow from the spores in simpler forms and serve in the specific ecosystem niche of small dangerous things that occupy Ork environments. They are food. The hair squig, worn as a hat, alive, attached to the head through the specific method of a creature that can grip with its teeth and which feeds on whatever it can reach from its position. The specific aesthetic of an Ork wearing a living creature on their head as both hat and status symbol is characteristic of how Ork culture approaches the boundary between decoration and function. Battle squigs. Orks on bikes are often accompanied by squigs that have been trained, using the specific Ork method of training, which involves a great deal of aggression and a great deal of yelling, to run alongside the vehicles and attack the enemy's legs. The specific contribution of a small aggressive creature to a vehicle assault is marginal from a pure military standpoint. The specific enthusiasm with which squigs participate in vehicle assaults and the specific visual chaos they contribute to the encounter is culturally significant. Squig pipes. The musical instrument made from a living squig, produced by the specific Ork genius for finding functions in everything available. The sound produced by squig pipes is not pleasant by any standard that does not include extremely loud and aggressive as aesthetic virtues. It is beloved by Orks. The relationship with Gork and Mork. The Ork religious tradition is more complex than the standard summary of they believe in two gods who represent brutality and cunning in different orders suggests. The specific practices through which Orks relate to their gods, the big Waaaghs and little Waaaghs, that are identified as the two modes of invoking divine power, the warpheads who channel the divine energy most directly, the specific theological positions of different clans regarding which god's specific quality to emphasize, constitute a genuine religious culture. The warphead, the specific Ork psyker, whose connection to Gork and Mork is strong enough that they can channel the gods' attention toward the battlefield in specific ways, not simply a weird boy who absorbs the Waaagh field and expresses it explosively. A practitioner who has developed enough control over the field's specifically divine dimensions to invoke effects that the Ork tradition recognizes as divine intervention. Whether Ghazghkull and Waaagh are actually intervening, whether the specific effects produced by warpheads are divine actions, or Waaagh field physics expressed in ways that Ork theology interprets as divine, is the same question that applies to all deity intervention in the 40K universe. The Chaos Gods are real, and their interventions are observable. Whether the Ork gods are real in the same way, whether the psychic mass of Ork collective belief has produced entities in the warp equivalent to the 4 ruinous powers, is not confirmed or denied by the setting's canonical sources. The Orks believe they are real. The effects that Ork religious practice produces are real. The specific difference between real gods and collective belief that generates real effects without requiring real gods is not a distinction that the Ork theological tradition finds necessary. Sleep well. 2 more parts remain, and the greatest Waaagh is still building. The Great Rift changed the galaxy. Every faction's situation was altered by the specific catastrophe of a galaxy-spanning warp tear that divided the Imperium, disrupted navigation, intensified the presence of the ruinous powers, and created the specific conditions of the Dark Imperium, where isolated worlds faced crises without the support that the Imperium's integration had previously provided. For the Orks, as noted, the Great Rift was not a straightforwardly bad development. The specific conditions of the Dark Imperium, the isolation, the disruption, the multiple simultaneous crises overwhelming the Imperium's response capacity, were conditions that favored the Ork approach to conflict, not through planning, through the specific alignment between what the Orks were and what the changed galaxy required. Tonight, we look at the Orks in the era of the Dark Imperium, what the various major Ork figures are doing, what the Ork presence means for the galaxy's political and military landscape, and what the specific threat they represent looks like when the broader context is understood. Ghazghkull in the Dark Imperium. Ghazghkull, after leaving Armageddon following the Third War, had been moving, not in the undirected way of a war boss who had lost his purpose, with the specific intention of a being who had a goal and was taking the steps necessary to achieve it. His stated goal remained the greatest Waaagh in history. The specific scale he was aiming for required conditions that the 41st Millennium had not yet produced. A galaxy sufficiently disrupted, a war field sufficiently concentrated, a personal authority sufficiently established across enough of the Ork species' distributed population that the specific critical mass of the greatest war could be reached. The Great Rift's aftermath was providing some of those conditions. The disruption of the Imperium's military deployment meant that worlds that would previously have received reinforcement in the face of Ork aggression were facing that aggression alone. The specific isolation of Imperial systems from each other meant that the Orks could consolidate gains that would previously have been contested before consolidation was possible. Ghazghkull had begun a more systematic approach to building the war, not simply fighting and growing and attracting followers through the conventional war boss mechanism, conducting specific campaigns that were designed to increase the war's overall strength, rather than to achieve immediate military objectives. Campaigns whose targets were chosen for the specific resource they provided to the war's long-term development, rather than for the fighting they offered. An Ork who was thinking strategically across decades. An Ork who was, in the specific theological framework his vision had provided, working toward a divine mandate rather than simply fighting because fighting was what Orks did. Whether the greatest war he was building toward would exceed the beast's scale. Whether the specific conditions of the Dark Imperium would provide what the war of the beast had required remained uncertain, but the trajectory was towards something unprecedented. The Ork presence across the galaxy. The specific distribution of Ork activity in the Dark Imperium's era is not organized around a single Waaagh or a single theater. It is dispersed, the specific outcome of a species that reproduces through spores across every world it has ever inhabited, that generates new war bands continuously from those spores, that has been fighting across the galaxy since before the Imperium existed. Every major segmentum contains significant Ork activity, not the specific large-scale wars that receive the major historical designations. The constant background of smaller wars and raiding forces and established Ork presences that require ongoing Imperial military attention. The Sharadon Empire remains the longest surviving Ork political entity, the specific exception to the rule that Ork military structures disperse at the death of their leadership, has continued under successive war bosses. Its presence in the Segmentum Solar represents a permanent fixed-address Ork threat that the Imperium has been managing for millennia. The Vigilus Orks, the Speedwaa, that had contested the critical transit system during the Indomitus Crusades' efforts to connect the Imperium's two halves, was not simply defeated and dispersed. The specific Ork presence in the Vigilus system continued as an ongoing obstacle to the strategic objective that the system represented. Vigilus as a transit point between Imperium Sanctus and Imperium Nihilus required that the Ork presence there be managed continuously rather than resolved once. The Octarius remnants, the specific Orks who had fought the Tyranids in the Octarius War and survived, were larger and more capable than standard Orks. The specific growth produced by prolonged combat against an extremely capable opponent had generated a population of Orks that were closer to the Krork standard than any Orks the galaxy had produced since the war in Heaven's aftermath. These enhanced Orks did not simply die when the conflict in Octarius ended. They dispersed, carrying the specific capabilities that fighting Tyranids had produced in them. The Mech Boys and the Arms Race. One of the less visible but more significant Ork developments in the Dark Imperium era. The specific acceleration of Mech Boy innovation driven by the quantity and quality of salvageable technology available in a galaxy that was experiencing multiple catastrophes simultaneously. Catastrophes produced debris, the specific destruction of Imperial warships, the abandonment of worlds under chaos pressure, the specific wreckage of Tyranid conflict. All of it generated the raw material that Mech Boys needed for the specific inventions that the warfield enabled them to produce. The Meganob, the specific heavy Ork warrior in the most advanced Ork armor. Meganobs had existed before, but the Dark Imperium era produced Meganobs in quantities and at quality levels that the Ork tradition had not previously sustained. The specific combination of salvaged Imperial armor components and Mech Boy modification had produced Ork heavy infantry that approached the specific capability of Space Marines in individual combat terms, if not in the more nuanced qualities of training and tactical discipline. The Gorkanaut and Morkanaut, the two specific Ork Walker designs that embodied the highest level of Mech Boy ambition in the Dark Imperium era, each named for one of the two Ork gods, each designed to embody the specific quality of the god it honored. The Gorkanaut for direct violent impact, the Morkanaut for the cunning application of that same violence. Both were enormous. both were armed with weapons that Mechboy construction had made functional through the specific combination of salvage technology and Waaagh field supplementation. The innovation was continuous. The Orks could not be technologically outdated in the way that other factions risked technological obsolescence, because Mechboy innovation was not dependent on the specific institutional processes of research and development that human technology required. A Mechboy who needed to do something new simply did the new thing, and the Waaagh field made it work. And the next Mechboy who saw the new thing understood intuitively how to replicate it or improve on it. Yarrik's last stand, Sebastian Yarrik. The commissar who had made fighting Ghazghkull his life's work, who had lost a hand to the war boss, who had been freed by the war boss, who had defended Armageddon twice, and whose specific authority and knowledge of Ork tactics had been the specific resource that the Imperium had deployed against Ghazghkull's campaigns. He was old. The bionics that had replaced the arm were aging. The specific toll of a life spent at the extreme end of Imperial military service, the campaigns, the wounds, the specific psychological weight of having devoted decades to understanding an enemy who had made you his personal project as much as you had made him yours, had accumulated in the specific way that human aging accumulates even in beings who have received every augmentation available. He continued fighting. The specific determination that had characterized his entire career was not diminished by age. The commissar who had held Armageddon against the First and Second Wars continued to serve, continued to advise, to train, to maintain the specific institutional knowledge of Ork tactics that the Imperium's ongoing conflicts required. The relationship between Yarrik and Ghazghkull remained the defining feature of both their careers. The war boss who had freed his greatest opponent, the commissar who had made understanding that war boss his primary professional achievement, the specific mutual respect of two beings who had made each other better by being worth fighting. This dynamic continued to shape both of them, even in the specific absence of direct confrontation. The Deathskulls and technology acquisition. A specific development worth noting in the Dark Imperium's context. The Deathskull's particular genius for acquiring technology had been applied to the specific abundance of advanced technology available in a galaxy experiencing multiple simultaneous catastrophes. The Deathskulls looted. They looted Imperial ships. They looted Chaos Warband equipment. They looted Necron constructs when they found Necron tombs. The specific impracticability of this from any conventional risk assessment perspective, being completely invisible to the Deathskulls, who saw technology worth acquiring and attempted to acquire it regardless of what had been guarding it. Necron technology that was successfully looted by Deathskulls was not successfully operated by Deathskulls in the way its designers had intended, but the war field made Necron technology respond to Ork use in ways that should not have been possible. The specific interface between Ork psychic reality adjustment and the phase-dimensional mechanics of Necron constructs produced results that neither the Orks nor the Necrons had predicted. Whether this constituted looting being successful or looting being something worse than failed was a question the Deathskulls did not pause to consider. They had the technology. It was doing things. The things it was doing were impressive. This was successful looting. The Necrons found this deeply offensive. The specific Necron response to Deathskulls looting their tomb worlds was not simply military. It was the specific quality of institutional offense that beings 60 million years old feel when their most sophisticated technology is being used by creatures that should not be able to comprehend it, and that are somehow using it anyway. What the Orks mean for the galaxy. The strategic question that the galaxy's other factions have never been able to fully answer. What do you do about the Orks? You cannot eliminate them. The spores ensure that any world the Orks have inhabited will produce more Orks. Exterminatus, the total destruction of a world's biosphere, was the Imperium's most extreme available measure for addressing chaos, corruption, or tyrannid infestation. Against Orks, it was not reliably effective, because Ork spores could survive the specific conditions of the bombardment that Exterminatus typically employed. You cannot negotiate with them. The Ork species does not have a political structure capable of entering into and maintaining agreements. There is no Ork government that could sign a treaty. There is no Ork authority that could enforce whatever had been signed. The specific political philosophy of Ork civilization. The biggest Ork gets what they want, and no other arrangement is recognized as binding, is incompatible with the treaty model. You cannot outlast them. The Ork species has been fighting for 60 million years. The specific civilizations that have tried to simply survive until the Orks were gone have themselves been gone for millennia, while the Orks continued. The Imperium of Man is 10,000 years old. The Orks predate it by 590,000 years. You can manage them. This is the specific answer that the Imperium and the Elder and the Toe and every other civilization that has tried to address the Ork problem has arrived at through millennia of attempted alternatives. You fight the specific Waaaghs that are most dangerous. You address the most concentrated Ork presences before they can reach the specific critical mass that produces the most dangerous Waaaghs. You maintain the specific military capacity to contain rather than eliminate. The management is permanent, not a phase of the problem, the permanent condition of a species that coexists with the Orks, the background noise of Ork aggression that requires ongoing response, the specific campaigns that are always necessary and that are never the last time the campaign will be necessary. The Orks are not a problem to be solved. They are a condition of the galaxy. 60 million years of being designed by the Old Ones for the specific purpose of fighting have produced a species that will be fighting as long as the galaxy is capable of producing something to fight. Sleep well. One final part remains, and the greatest Waaagh may already be beginning. Let everything slow. We have followed the Orks from the war in heaven, and the Old Ones' specific engineering decision that produced the Krorks, through the devolution that the war's end produced, through 60 million years of autonomous existence, and the specific civilizations and campaigns and Waaaghs that those years contained. We have followed Ghazghkull from his bolter-shell injury, through 2.5 Armageddon wars and decapitation and reconstruction. We have looked at Ork society from the inside, the teeth economy, the pain boys, the squigs, the religious tradition. Now we step back and ask the final question. What is the Ork species really? Not as a military threat, or a cultural phenomenon, or a specific collection of campaigns and war bosses. As an entity in the galaxy's history. What do the Orks mean? The weapon that outlasted the war. The Old Ones built the Krorks for the war in heaven. The specific purpose that informed every design decision, the continuous growth in response to combat, the spore reproduction that made elimination impossible, the collective psychic field that generated divine support and enabled their technology, was the war in heaven and the specific demands it made. The war in heaven ended, the Old Ones were gone, the Citan were shattered, the Necrons slept. The Elder Empire rose and destroyed itself. Humanity crawled from the caves to the stars and built an empire and watched it nearly collapse and built it again. The Orks kept fighting. The specific tragedy and the specific comedy of the Orks in the 41st millennium. The quality that makes them simultaneously one of the most threatening and one of the most oddly sympathetic factions in the setting, is that they are still doing what they were made to do. Not because they have a choice, because the old ones designed them without a stopping condition. The Krorks were built to fight until the war was won. The war ended. No one told them. The design had no provision for that outcome. 60 million years of fighting what is available because what they were built to fight is gone. The Tyranids, the Chaos Forces, the Imperium, each other. These are the specific available adversaries in a galaxy that no longer contains the specific adversary the Orks were built to fight. They are not failing at their purpose. They are fulfilling it continuously in perpetuity against whatever the galaxy provides. The specific joy that Orks express in combat, the Waaagh cry, the enthusiasm, the specific absence of the psychological damage that prolonged violence produces in beings who were not designed for it, is the joy of something doing what it was made to do. An Ork in a fight is an Ork in its natural state, not a tragedy, not a psychological wound expressing itself in violence, a design specification being met. The question of consciousness, the Orks think. This is more significant than it initially appears in a setting full of intelligent species. The Orks think in the specific ways that their biology and their culture produce, ways that are different from human thinking in emphasis and priority, but not in fundamental capacity. Ghazghkull thinks, not simply in the reactive tactical way of a creature that has been fighting long enough to have internalized effective patterns, in the specific deliberate way of someone who is pursuing a long-term goal and making decisions in the present that are organized around a future state they are working toward. The prophet of the Waaagh, who has been building toward the greatest Waaagh for decades, is doing something that requires holding a model of the future in mind and updating it continuously as circumstances change. Gretchen think. Their specific thinking is mostly organized around survival, around the particular intelligence of something that is small and fragile in a very dangerous environment, and that has survived by being very good at predicting where the danger will be. But it is thinking. The Gretchen who avoids the run-third while appearing to comply, who identifies the specific trajectory of the Ork fight before it reaches them, who manages the specific social navigation of being at the absolute bottom of a violent hierarchy. This is not instinct. It is a specific form of intelligence applied to the most demanding problem available. The mech boys think. The specific kind of thinking that produces stompers and deaf dreads, and the specific innovations of Ork technology. This is not the unthinking application of inherited knowledge. It is creative problem solving. The mech boy who looks at a broken Necron phase blade and figures out how to make it work as part of an Ork war machine is doing something that requires genuine cognitive creativity. The specific question that the Orks raise for the galaxy's philosophical traditions, and that the galaxy's philosophical traditions have mostly declined to engage with because the Orks tend to interrupt philosophical traditions with Waaaghs, is whether the species that was made to fight is choosing to fight or compelled to fight, whether the joy the Orks express in combat is genuine experience or the specific mechanical expression of design parameters, whether Ghazghkull is a person pursuing a purpose or a very sophisticated biological weapon expressing its programming. The setting does not answer this. It provides the parallel question about other species, whether the Chaos God's servants are choosing their service or compelled by corruption, whether the Necrons' reduced consciousness constitutes genuine personhood, whether the Tyranid organisms have any experience beyond the hive mind's direction. These questions are the specific philosophical texture of the 40K universe, and the Orks' version of them is the most explicitly funny and the most genuinely unresolved. the Orks' relationship to the warp. Every psychically active species in the 40K universe has a specific relationship to the warp. The psychic dimension that underlies material reality, where the emotional and spiritual weight of conscious beings accumulates into forces and entities. The Chaos Gods are the accumulated psychic weight of specific human emotional extremes. Khorne of rage and war, Tzeentch of hope and ambition, Nurgle of despair and acceptance, Slaanesh of excess and desire. They are what the warp produces when enough beings feel those things intensely enough. Gork and Mork are the accumulated psychic weight of Ork collective belief and emotion. The specific content of what the Orks feel most intensely, the joy of fighting, the specific satisfaction of a good Waaagh, the reverence for the biggest and strongest, has been accumulating in the warp since the Old Ones created the Krorks. 60 million years of Ork fighting is 60 million years of Ork psychic weight in the warp. The specific gods that this weight has produced, if Gork and Mork are real in the specific sense that the Chaos Gods are real, would be among the most ancient divine entities in the setting. Older than the Emperor, older than the Eldar gods who were eventually consumed by Slaanesh, contemporary with or older than Chaos itself. Whether Gork and Mork have the specific kind of reality that the Chaos Gods have is not confirmed. The Chaos Gods are documented as real entities with observable effects. The Ork Gods' reality is argued from the specific effects of the Waaagh field and the specific capabilities of Weird Boys and Warpheads. The gap between the Waaagh field produces effects that the Ork tradition interprets as divine, and Gork and Mork are real entities in the warp, is real, but may not be as large as it appears. The most interesting possibility, if the Ork gods are real, they are the specific gods of a species that has been fighting continuously for 60 million years. The psychic weight behind them is immense. Their specific character, brutality and cunning in interchangeable order, is the concentrated essence of 60 million years of Ork combat experience. They would be, in the specific terms of warp entities, extraordinarily powerful and extraordinarily specific, not the broad emotional portfolios of the Chaos Gods, but the single concentrated quality of the most successful fighting species the galaxy has ever produced. One final look at Ghazghkull. The prophet of the Waaagh, as the setting's current narrative depicts him, is building towards something. The greatest Waaagh in history, the specific divine mandate he received from Gork and Mork through the surgery that should have killed him and did not, is the organizing principle of everything he has done since the injury on an unnamed world in the Goth clan's territory. He is bigger now than at Armageddon. He has been fighting continuously since the injury, and Ork biology has been producing in him the specific growth that continuous fighting produces. The being who arrived at Armageddon for the Third War, and who survived decapitation through Grotznik's genius, is not the same physical size as the being that exists now, decades later, in the specific conditions of the Dark Imperium's chaos. He is, in the way of things that were built to grow from fighting, and have been fighting for a very long time, very large. Whether he achieves the greatest Waaagh, whether the specific conditions of the Dark Imperium's disrupted galaxy provide what he needs to build to the scale of the Beast campaign or beyond, is one of the setting's open narratives. The 40K universe does not resolve these questions in the ways that finished stories resolve their central tensions. It provides the ongoing conditions and the specific trajectory and trusts the reader to understand that the trajectory is pointing towards something extraordinary. The galaxy does not know if Ghazghkull will succeed. It knows that he is trying, that he has survived everything that has been thrown at him, that the specific conviction of a being who believes he has received a divine mandate is the most dangerous kind of conviction to face in combat. He spoke with the word of the gods. Whole worlds burn in his boot prints. The greatest Waaagh is coming. Whether the galaxy is ready for it is another question. What the Orks mean for the setting. The 40K universe is a setting organized around grimdark, the specific aesthetic of hopelessness and endless war, and the absence of clean victories. In this context, the Orks serve a specific function that is different from the other factions' functions. The Tyranids are despair. The Chaos Powers are corruption. The Necrons are ancient inevitability. The Imperium is the specific tragedy of a civilization that was trying to build something good and produce something that preserved survival at the cost of almost everything that made survival worth pursuing. The Orks are exuberance. In a setting defined by horror and endless suffering and the specific weight of civilizations that know they are losing, the Orks are the specific counternote. The faction that finds the war fun, that approaches the galaxy's endless violence with the specific joy of something doing what it was built for and doing it well. They are also the setting's most specific philosophical joke. The Old One's weapon, built to fight the Necrons, is still here. The Necrons are still here. The war that produced both of them is still being fought, 60 million years later, in the context of the 41st millennium, where neither faction has a complete understanding of the connection between them. The Orks fight on. They fight the Imperium and the Tyranids and the Chaos Forces and each other and the Elder and the Tall and whatever else is available. They fight with the specific joy of something that has found its purpose and intends to fulfill it indefinitely. The galaxy is full of terrible things. The Orks are one of them. They are also in the specific register of terrible things that are genuinely having a wonderful time. The galaxy's most honest, terrible thing. They were made to fight. They are fighting. 60 million years after the purpose they were made for was completed, they are still the best at what they do. And what they do is exactly what they were built for. One final image. Somewhere in the galaxy, a Waaagh is building. The specific Ork war boss at its center, larger than his followers, drawing more followers through the specific psychic gravity of the Waaagh field, growing larger from the fights that the gathering Waaagh produces, is becoming something that the galaxy will have to notice. The mech boys in his warband are building things. The specific creative violence of Ork engineering is being applied to whatever is available, and the things being built are functional in ways that should not be possible, and are anyway. The Gretchen are running to keep up, carrying things, avoiding the specific violence that the gathering creates while staying close enough to the gathering to remain useful. The squigs are being eaten and painted and ridden and used as musical instruments and fought and bred and thrown at enemies, because that is what squigs are for. And somewhere at the edge of the gathering, the Waaagh field is generating the specific low hum of collective Ork psychic energy building toward the specific threshold at which it becomes irresistible. The specific sound of 60 million years of design specification being met, of purpose being fulfilled, of the galaxy's most persistent military force preparing to express itself at whatever scale the current generation makes possible. Waaagh! This has been the entire Warhammer 40,000 Orks timeline. From the war in heaven and the Old One's engineering decision, through 60 million years of continuous fighting, through the Beast and Ghazghkull, and the 3 wars for Armageddon, and the Dark Imperium, and the Octarius War, to the galaxy's most present and most permanent military problem. Told slowly, over 8 nights, for the space between waking and the next Waaagh, the Orks are still building. Good night, my friend.